This is Croatia. Along the southern part of the country, there are islands, and the one we need is Millet. There are two spots here where ships from India arrived. They unloaded crates carrying an animal the island had never seen before, hauled them into the forest, and released them there. For years, local people had been dying from bites by venomous horned vipers. Encounters on farms and in the fields had been happening regularly since 1910. Back then, there was no medical cure on the island, so the only real solution seemed to be the snake's natural enemy, the mongoose. In India, mongooses are known for killing snakes in huge numbers, so the Croats went there, gathered the animals they needed, and brought them over on those ships. The mongooses settled in, started breeding, and spread across the island, but instead of doing the job they were brought in for, which is killing snakes, they did something that threw the island into chaos for more than a century. It became one of the biggest mistakes Croatia ever made. The mongooses were introduced under a decision by the Austro-Hungarian Ministry of Agriculture. At the time, these lands were under Austro-Hungarian control, and the authorities were trying to solve what they saw as a serious problem. Of course, it was never as simple as bring them over and release them immediately. When animals are transported long distances, they have to be prepared first, or they simply will not survive. Even back then, people understood that. First, they had to make sure the mongooses could actually adapt and wouldn't die as soon as they arrived. So they were not released immediately, they were kept in quarantine first. The process was supervised by senior forester and engineer Carlo Nayedli. The mongooses spent more than a month in a specially built enclosure, gradually adjusting to the local climate and conditions. And then things got out of hand. But where did they even get these animals if mongooses don't exist in Europe in the first place? They're not native to the region, so there was no way to catch them nearby and simply move them to Croatia. To make the whole plan work, they had to look to the animals' original homeland, far outside Europe. In the end, they chose South Asia. The mongooses were brought in specifically from India, where they had long been known for being highly effective against snakes, including venomous ones. And how many mongooses did they actually bring over if the goal was not just to show them off, but to establish a real population on the island? Obviously, one or two animals would never have survived long enough to build a population. They would have died out before reproducing. Hey, how's it going? Ew. Well, I gave it my best shot, guys. To establish the species, they needed several animals right from the start, enough to breed and form a stable group. So this was clearly calculated in advance, and there's even an exact number. 11 mongooses were brought to Millet. That was considered enough for them to start breeding and increase their numbers on their own without any new arrivals. By the way, was 11 just a random number, or was it all carefully planned? It's an odd number, not exactly something you can neatly pair off. What mattered was not only the number of animals, or even how many pairs that number could make, but also how many were males and how many were females. If that balance was wrong, reproduction could slow down dramatically or fail altogether. In the end, the island received 7 males and 4 females. That ratio was supposed to speed up reproduction and help the mongooses establish themselves as quickly as possible. Of course, the release location also mattered. That directly affected how fast the animals would spread across the island. They needed water, shelter, and enough prey. Without those things, they would have never taken hold. So this couldn't have been some random patch of land. They needed a place where the mongooses would have an immediate advantage and decent living conditions. And they found exactly such a place. Records show that the animals were released in the Valina Vodica area near the settlement of Govedari, within what's now Millet National Park. How about here? They got a free bar, breakfast. Nah, I want beachfront. It's all beachfront, Steve. It's a damn island. And when exactly were they released? If this wasn't some vague, drawn-out process, but a carefully organized operation? In cases like this, everything gets recorded precisely. There's administration, reporting, oversight. That way, officials can later evaluate the outcome and track the consequences. The mongooses were released on August 25, 1910. That was the day it all began. From there, they established themselves on the island and gradually spread across Millet. But why were these animals able to survive there at all, when stories like this often end in failure? Usually, introduced species can't handle the new conditions. The climate's different, food may be limited, plus there's competition. And just like that, the population is gone. For it to work, several things had to line up at once. The environment had to suit them, and they had to be able to adapt fast. On Millet, that's exactly what happened. mongooses turned out to be extremely flexible. They adapted easily, found plenty of food, and began breeding aggressively within the first few years. In the end, they didn't just survive, they quickly multiplied and secured a permanent foothold on the island. You could even say they began taking it over. The real question is how quickly they spread after settling in. When conditions are favorable and nothing really stands in the way, introduced species often increase in number very fast and expand into new territory, especially when there's plenty of food and no real predators. The process can become extremely aggressive then. On Millet, the mongooses first moved beyond the original release site and then fairly quickly spread across almost the entire island. Very little stood in their way, so they established themselves everywhere and within a few decades become a normal part of the local ecosystem. Okay, but what happens next when predators on an island keep multiplying? In a closed system, that kind of pressure quickly starts crushing prey populations, especially when the prey is easy to catch and has few ways to defend itself. Over time, that reshapes the entire animal community on any island, and Millet was no exception. Mongooses actively hunted snakes, and that was one of the main reasons they'd been introduced in the first place. So the introduced animals did exactly what they were brought in to do? Amazing. Is it just me, or is this a first for us? Within about 20 years, it became obvious that snake numbers had dropped sharply. A species that had once been considered common on the island was now edging close to disappearing. The mongooses ate them all, and that's when the real problem started. What does a predator do when its main prey is almost gone, but it still has to eat? It doesn't leave, and it doesn't magically reduce its own population. It simply looks for a new target. Food. If a species is adaptable enough, it shifts quickly and starts feeding on whatever's available. On Millet, the mongooses turned to other small animals, and birds were hit the hardest. Ground nesting birds, and especially those nesting low in bushes, became extremely easy prey. Eggs and chicks were wiped out with almost no resistance. Even migratory birds were affected when they stopped on the island during their journeys. Phew, that was a long flight. 3 layovers. Hey, you landed on the wrong island! Can this be written off as a few rare incidents, or was it much more serious? Once a predator becomes established and has almost nothing keeping it in check, its impact goes far beyond isolated victims. Put simply, it just keeps getting worse. At some point, the damage reaches the entire ecosystem. Some bird populations on Millet almost vanished, especially species that lived in low vegetation and hedgerows. The effects can still be seen today. Birds that were once common are now seen far less often or have disappeared altogether. Even ordinary sparrows are now rarely seen on the island. But was it only wildlife that suffered, or did the mongoose problem start affecting people too? When predator numbers get high and they stop fearing humans, they begin searching for food near homes. And the first to suffer are usually the most harmless animals of all, domestic ones. As they grew bolder, mongooses on Millet started entering yards and attacking poultry. Chickens and chicks turned out to be even easier prey than the already depleted wild birds. Before long, this became a problem for everyone living nearby. Did the damage stop with animals, or did it go further and affect people's livelihoods too? Well, once predators become too numerous, they affect not only wildlife, but also the things people depend on to live. They move toward easy food sources and gradually start interfering with agriculture. Millet became a textbook example. In addition to raiding chicken coops, mongooses began getting into vineyards and orchards, damaging plantings and harming crops in general. And that's an economic blow to the island because these crops are an important part of local life. And as usual in stories like this, it all comes back to one question. What was the point of all this in the first place? Bringing a new predator onto an island is a huge risk. Decisions like that are not made casually, especially not by a government. So the problem must have been genuinely serious. And on Millet, it really was. For a long time, the island was believed to have an unusually large number of snakes. People even called it the Island of Snakes. There were so many that it stopped feeling like a nuisance and started feeling like a real danger. Ordinary people were worried. The authorities were worried. And eventually they began looking for a way to reduce the snake population and make life on the island safer. But was it really that serious? How many snakes does there have to be before absolutely everyone starts panicking? If the government stepped in, then this was clearly more than just an inconvenience. There had to be a real and serious threat. There were recorded cases of snakes biting both people and livestock on the island. That meant real losses and real health risks. especially in a place where medical help wasn't always easy to get. So yes, people saw it as a serious problem and they decided to act. By the way, what kinds of snakes were actually living there? Not all of them would have been truly dangerous. Different species may have lived on the island, and not all of them would have posed a threat to humans or livestock. To understand why people were so worried, it's important to know which species they were actually dealing with. The main problem was the nose-horned viper, Vipera amidites. It's strikingly beautiful and possibly the most dangerous snake you can encounter in Europe. Naturally, it's venomous, and its bites can cause severe consequences. Honestly, I can see why the locals were so on edge. But were the snakes causing real damage, or were people just afraid and exaggerating the threat? Judging by the measures that were taken, this was not some vague or imaginary danger. You don't introduce predators for no reason, so the consequences must already have been serious. For the authorities to approve a step like that, the problem had to be enormous, impossible to ignore or dismiss. Do something about the snakes! We can't live like this! You're exaggerating. It's not that bad. In fact, venomous snakes were not just a common sight on the island. Their bites were killing livestock, and in some cases, they were deadly for people as well. So this wasn't just an unpleasant situation, it was a disaster waiting to happen, and something had to be done about it. So why did they choose mongooses specifically when there were other possible ways to deal with snakes? Presumably, they had some clear advantage. Any ordinary predator might simply die from a bite and wipe out all the effort people had made. They needed an animal that could withstand venom and actively hunt snakes. Mongooses fit that role perfectly. They're well known for being highly resistant to snake venom and incredibly quick in a fight. Though honestly, maybe they should have brought in honey badgers. Now that I would have liked to see. So how well did it actually work? Luckily, the snake population gives us a pretty clear answer. If the method was effective, it should show up there first. And on Millet, the effect became visible within the first few decades. Mongooses really did hunt snakes actively, and the result was noticeable. The viper population began to decline rapidly. At first, it looked like a successful solution, a smart choice, and a strategy that had worked exactly as intended. Give everybody a medal. But can we really say the problem was fully solved if dangerous snakes no longer occur on the island? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. If the threat's gone, then the plan worked exactly as intended. It seems pretty simple. Are there bites or not? Is there still a risk to people and livestock or not? By that measure, the result was real. Vipers stopped being a problem and life on the island became safer. Formally, the goal was achieved. What had once caused serious concern for the authorities simply stopped existing as a risk factor. No snakes, no problem. But if you look beyond just getting rid of the snakes, can this really be called a success? Every ecosystem depends on balance. The moment you interfere with one part of it, remove it, or change it, you almost always set off changes everywhere else. And once that balance is broken, the consequences can spread far beyond the original problem. That's exactly what happened on Millet. They got rid of one problem only to create another, bigger and harder to deal with. The mongooses didn't stop at the snakes. They began affecting life across the entire island. Over time, it became clear that they were no longer helpful allies, but an invasive species causing constant damage to the local environment. Hooray for the mongooses! The mongooses are our heroes! Mongooses suck! Yeah, mongooses suck! We hate mongooses! Were they ever able to get rid of the mongooses once it became obvious they were harming the island? In situations like this, people usually try at least to reduce the population of a harmful species and sometimes to wipe it out completely. On the surface, the solution seems obvious, but in practice, it turned out to be much more complicated. Even after the damage became clear, the mongooses didn't go anywhere. They still live on Millet today and remain part of the island's ecosystem. The mongooses became so firmly established on the island that getting rid of them is now impossible. So once people realized the mongooses were harming the island, were they able to get rid of them? After all, there are cases where invasive species have been removed successfully. In theory, it can be done, especially on an island where the area is limited, but it takes resources, constant monitoring, and methods that actually work. In practice, the mongooses turned out to be far too difficult to control. They reproduce quickly, hide well, and adapt easily to different conditions. Due to that, any attempts to reduce their numbers only brought temporary results. You remove 10, and before long, 10 more are born. And now they're hiding even better. In the end, no one managed to bring the population under control, and the mongooses are still on the island to this day. But did anyone actually try to control the mongooses once it became clear the situation was spiraling and that wiping them out completely was no longer possible? In cases like that, people usually bring in all kinds of measures. For example, paying bounties for captured animals and trying to put more pressure on the population. That's exactly what they did on Millet. They offered cash rewards for catching mongooses to get local people involved. Then they went even further. Wild boars were introduced to the island in the hope that they would destroy mongoose burrows and help drive the numbers down. So we introduced an invasive species to deal with the snakes. Correct. And now there are too many of them, so we're bringing in yet another invasive species. Exactly. Brilliant plan. Approved. But that only made things worse. Over time, once the payment stopped, people lost interest in hunting them, and the population never really came under control. But did any of these measures at least achieve something? That's actually easy to judge. If a method works, the population goes down and the pressure on the ecosystem eases. But that never happened on Millet. Despite bounties, hunting, and even attempts to influence the population indirectly through other species, mongoose numbers never dropped in any meaningful way. They recovered too quickly, and the overall impact of all these efforts was minimal. In the end, none of the measures worked in the long run, and the problem stayed more or less at the same level. So maybe something in this whole story should have been done differently, especially if the result was even more problems than before. When the consequences turn out far worse than the original threat, that's a failure on a truly massive scale. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? They decided to solve one species problem by introducing another species without really understanding how it would behave in a new environment. Basically, a classic mistake. Biological control was used without any serious assessment of the risks or of what it could do to the system as a whole. The balance was disrupted, and that set off a chain of changes that can no longer be stopped. So, were there other options? If the real issue was dangerous snakes, then the answer didn't have to be bring in a predator, especially not on an island where everything's tightly connected and enclosed. There were softer, more manageable ways to deal with the problem without putting the entire ecosystem at risk. In situations like that, it makes more sense to work with conditions and human behavior. They could have restricted access to areas where snakes were more common, reduced encounters between snakes, people, and livestock, and introduced protective measures. That would have helped keep the danger under control without breaking the natural balance or creating new problems. But in the early 20th century, people were not really thinking that way. So what does this story teach us if we look at it not just as an isolated incident, but as an example of how people deal with complex problems? Think first, act second. When one decision sets off a chain of consequences and ends up damaging an entire system, that usually means the problem was underestimated from the start. And also that somebody messed up badly. Nature doesn't work like a simple machine where you can swap out one part and expect a predictable result. Everything's connected, and every intervention triggers other changes. If you fail to account for that, things can spiral out of control very quickly, and once that happens, regaining control can be nearly impossible. You owe me a like. See you later.